All right, Judy, let's get started. Today is February 14th, 2021. It is snowing outside, and this is the Faith and Function class. The speaker today is Patrick Gray. The class is being recorded, so hey, everybody, you're being recorded. Go for it, Judy.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's got power and is staying warm and safe this morning. Before I open us with prayer, are there any joys or concerns that people would like to share? Okay, in that case, if you would bow your heads for prayer, please. Holy God of love, on this wintry morning, we turn to you in gratitude for all the blessings and opportunities of this day. We are especially grateful for this time to gather to study and learn from your word. We ask your blessing on our teacher, Patrick, and also ask that our minds and hearts may be open to his message. We remember also this day all those who need shelter from the cold and ask that they may find warmth and care. We also remember those of our number who require healing and comfort. And I would mention Terry Bishop at this time and his wife, Carol, and others we lift silently up to you. May they know your blessings. All this we ask in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, as Daniel said, our teacher this morning continues in his second series. It's Patrick Gray, who is a professor of religious studies at Rhodes College, and he is going to talk with us again about Alexander the Great in the Bible. So go take it away, Patrick.
Thank you. Good to see everybody again. Hope you're warm. A few minutes ago, somebody, was it Linda? Somebody said something in chat, and so which reminded me to say, if you have any questions or anything, feel raise your hand or just break in or type it into chat or whatever. I'll try to multitask, and if there are comments over in chat, I'll see if I can address those. But that's. I'm trying to share my screen here before I start talking, because it is hard. It's hard to do more than one thing at a time, talk and chew gum. All right, let me get my screen set up there. Let me spread this out so I can see as many of your beautiful faces as I can. And you can see can you see a little bit of an outline here over on the side? It's not much, but it's something. Yep. All right, so it's good to be with you again here. Last week, I talked about Alexander the Great mostly as a political and a military figure, and where he fits in a succession of dynasties, empires, foreign empires that came to dominate militarily and politically the land of Israel, and how that shows up in the Bible, how it affects certain things in the Bible, and where Alexander fits into that. We had the Assyrians starting in the 8th century, dominating the land of Israel, this little New Jersey-sized little kingdom right on the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And they were followed by the Babylonians, and in the 7th and 6th century, destroyed the temple in 586. They were followed by the Persians and Cyrus the Great, who allowed the Judeans, the exiled Judeans, to return to the land, rebuild their temple, practice their religion, so long as it didn't rock the boat too much. Cyrus the Great was followed by Alexander the Great. No relation, even though they have the same last name, the Great. But that's where we stopped and paused a while and looked at Alexander and his empire, the extent of that empire, and how it shows up in the Bible, how it influences certain books in the Bible. And today, what I want to do is look more at the cultural significance of Alexander the Great. It's related to the military and the political significance that his brief career had. But I want to talk about Alexander and the cultural impact he had. So Alexander the Great, not only was he a military genius and he went about conquering, much of the known world, but he's also kind of an idealist, I suppose you could say, a cultural missionary even. he had been, I can't remember if I mentioned this, who was his teacher again? He had a private tutor. Does anybody remember who that private tutor was?
Aristotle.
Aristotle. I think maybe even Camille. I was reading your lips. I don't know if you said Aristotle too on mute. Right. Yeah. Aristotle, who born in 384, dies in 322, the year after Alexander the Great. So Aristotle impressed upon Alexander the Great just how great Greece was. He personally was, a force of nature, Aristotle. But 5th century Greece, which comes just before 4th century Greece, right, was one of the most impressive achievements in the history of the world. When you think about all the ancient Greeks just the names you may have studied, from high school and college, practically all of them lived in and around Athens in about a century and a half period. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pericles, Thucydides, Herodotus, the father of history. If you're a doctor, Hippocrates, you take the Hippocratic Oath, the kind of the father of medicine. The Parthenon was built. Demosthenes, a great orator. Sophocles, who wrote the Oedipus plays, Euripides, Aeschylus, Aristophanes, one of the greatest comedic playwrights. I could go on and on and on. Basically, every ancient Greek came from about a century and a half period in Greece, which is called Hellas in Greek. And Aristotle, so Aristotle kind of imparted that to Alexander, and Alexander was duly impressed. And he was duly impressed because it was pretty impressive. I mean, I don't know if there's intelligent life anywhere else in the universe, but the best argument in favor of aliens visiting this earth is 5th century Greece. I mean, how else can you explain the kind of cultural, artistic, intellectual kind of explosion that took place in that one small area in 1 century or so? I mean, imagine if Memphis had not only produced, Elvis and, B.B. King, but also, Shakespeare and Milton and Mozart and Einstein. What would you think about Memphis? Must be something in the water, or, really good public schools, something like that, right? So he was enamored with Greek culture. And as he went about conquering most of the known world, he wanted to share that Greek culture with everybody else. And so, here on the outline, I put the term Hellenic. Often Hellenic is used to refer to that kind of classical 5th century Greek culture. Hellenistic is like Greek-like, because remember, Alexander was Macedonian, related to Greece, but not exactly Greece. But as he went, from Greece and Macedonia and the Middle East, North Africa, all the way to India, he acted as a kind of a cultural missionary. According to, ancient stories, Aristotle, his teacher, also asked him to send back, kind of various kinds of scientific specimens, animals and plants and this kind of stuff for his own research. And so he was bringing that stuff west, but also bringing Greek culture east wherever he went. Primarily, first and foremost, perhaps the Greek language. When he conquered a place, you needed an administrative language, and it's going to be the language of the conquerors, right? So the Greek language was one big part of it, but other things as well. And he was an idealist in the sense that, he was a cosmopolitan. Now, what kind of a connotation, the word cosmopolitan, if you refer to, one of your, friends or relatives as cosmopolitan, what kind of a connotation does that have? What does it mean to call someone or something cosmopolitan?
Comfortable in a lot of situations.
Perfect. Yeah. I didn't ask him about drinking a cosmopolitan, but yeah, so comfortable in, so think about airports. If you kind of squint, most airports, you could be anywhere, right? I mean, maybe you can get barbecue, on Terminal B, you can get interstate barbecue here in Memphis, and you can't get that in Minneapolis. But airports are like, they're kind of the same. A person who is cosmopolitan is someone who is like Minnesota, you're comfortable everywhere, not just in your own little town or within your own culture, but you're, sophisticated and adaptable. And that was kind of Alexander's idea. The word cosmopolitan comes from the Greek words kosmos and polites. To be cosmopolitan in that sense means to be a polites of the cosmos, a citizen of the world, which is to be distinguished, right, from a citizen of, say, Athens, or a citizen of Jerusalem, or a citizen of Bactria, or some other kind of area like of those he conquered. So he wanted to downplay, if not erase, those kinds of cultural kinds of differences which divide human beings. He wants a universal brotherhood, if you will. We all want to be brothers and sisters. There are a number of sources that talk about a speech he gave, Alexander gave, on this topic to, at one place, this town called Opus, which is on the Tigris River, the Tigris and Euphrates. So as he's marching east, and he gave a speech to, according to these sources, 9,000 dignitaries and notables of all races. And in this speech, which has probably been embellished and added to, but it's reported in enough different sources that he probably gave this. This is kind of a stump speech, I guess he gave, where he said, he prayed for all sorts of blessings, and especially for harmony and fellowship in the empire between Macedonians and Persians in this one case. And that, according to some ancient writers, he emphasized that the distinction between people was not race, but between people who were good and who were bad. So you see how he's kind of downplaying these kind of cultural kind of specifics, and saying, hey, here's what we all have in common. And that sounds very nice and idealistic. And I think he probably really felt it. He really believed it. This is probably also in part, kind of a tool, a kind of a colonialist tool, right? Hey, let's, don't insist on being, so nationalistic. Join my empire so we can all live harmoniously. One expression of that, like I said, we're going to speak a common language. I'm not going to say you can't speak your language, but you're also going to speak my language. Greece is going to be the English of the ancient world, right? What's another really good, really effective way for creating like one big happy family that encompasses the world? What kind of things might happen that would make us all, one family? Not just speaking the same language, but what are some other things that might contribute to that? Anybody? Any ideas? We almost literally make ourselves one big family, right? By like marrying each other. Most cultures practice, some form of endogamy, marriage within the people, within the tribe, within the clan, something like that. And Alexander encouraged intermarriage. I mean, he wasn't unique in that respect. And of course, it went on before him, but he actively promoted it. He encouraged his men to marry among the local women of the peoples he conquered. He led the way by example, marrying a Persian princess named Roxanne. A lot of his men, happily followed his example. A lot of others didn't. They're like, we kind of like our, Macedonian, women. And probably not all the people that he conquered were eager to intermarry with him. Some were, some weren't, but that's one additional way of creating kind of this kind of universal brotherhood, sisterhood. He also adopted some other of the trappings of non-Greek rulers, like dressing in a certain way, kind of an Eastern way, and allowing people to bow down and worship him as if he were a god. uh, Ancient sources say that a lot of his Macedonian and Greek soldiers weren't really all that enthusiastic about that. They're like, no, we're not gonna bow down and worship you like a god. But a lot of this cultural missionary activity, if you will, takes place in cities, which he founds. He founds about 70 cities. They're not all like a metropolis or anything like that. But in those larger urban settings, you see more of this mixing between different peoples and more cultural activity that exhibits the kind of cosmopolitan characteristics that he wanted to promote. You see also something called syncretism a lot. Syncretism, there on the outline, that refers to kind of a mixing and matching different cultural, religious, linguistic, different things from different cultures. Again, not new, not unique to Alexander, but we see it quite a bit more in the Hellenistic period. If only because more people are coming into contact with each other, there's more movement in terms of trade. And so, so syncretism might, in a more modern context, think of for example, in Haiti, in Haiti, people practice, or not everybody, some people practice voodoo, but also practice Catholicism. And sometimes you'll, invoke certain Catholic saints, in the process of kind of doing, also practicing voodoo. Some would say yoga. Anybody do yoga? Some would say yoga. Yoga is an Indian, a Hindu religious, part of a Hindu religious practice. Now, most of us who do yoga, it's just like, no, I'm just trying to, kind of get in shape and be more limber. And there are, very few people in the United States practice yoga as a religious or a spiritual discipline, but there are actually a number of people, Hindus who say, wait a minute, you don't just kind of rip off my religious practice just so you can kind of like feel like you can, breathe better. We don't really think much about it. Most of the time when you're practicing syncretism, you're not really even aware of it, that you're kind of taking some practices here and there. So a lot of us do this kind of thing or see it. Let me see. Somebody in chat is giving us some. So yeah, Easter eggs and bunnies.
Having Christmas in December.
So in that, I don't know all the history of Christmas. Maybe you can say more, Daniel, but kind of sometimes you kind of say, let's have this holiday and piggyback on another pre-existing holiday. I don't know if that's what you have in mind. Yes. Yeah, so,
yeah, there was already a holiday in late December, and so I don't know exactly when it was determined that Jesus was definitely born in December. The Bible doesn't say.
Doesn't give the date, right? Or having a Christmas tree. I think the tree part is some kind of like German pagan, ritual or something, but we kind of adapted it and folded it into kind of a Christian holiday. In the New Testament, fast forwarding a little bit from the time of Alexander, there's a place in Acts, for example, where Paul and Barnabas are traveling around and doing all these great deeds, and the people who they're trying to convert to Christianity say, "Wow, here we have Zeus and Hermes walking among us. Let's sacrifice a bull to them." And they're like, whoa. I mean, I appreciate the welcome, but we're not God. So they were not saying it's this or that. It's either Greek religion or Jewish. It's both, and that's more typical in this period. Is we're not gonna choose one thing or the other. We're gonna just keep adding on. One religion to another religion. More is better. Not less is more, but more is better. maybe you're familiar, when you study kind of Greek and Roman myth in high school. Who's the king of the gods? What's the name of the king of the gods? Anybody?
Zeus in the Greek
Zeus.
mythology, and Jupiter in the Roman.
Jupiter, Roman. Yeah, you see almost all, not all of them, but almost all of those gods have a counterpart. Now they're the exact same god. In some ways, during the Hellenistic period, we traveled to other places like, oh, you have a goddess of love. We have a goddess of love. We will identify them and say, Venus is Aphrodite, and sometimes they'll have some additional things, but we'll just kind of merge them together. So that's various examples of syncretism that becomes much more common in Alexander's world. One of my favorite examples, there's a I learned about this when I studied Vietnam, the Vietnam War, and there's a Vietnamese religion called Cao Dai, and it kind of combines Buddhism with Christianity and kind of animistic religions, and they have this kind of cathedral where Jesus and Muhammad and Charlie Chaplin and Victor Hugo and Muhammad and many other people are revered as saints, and they have these, what kind of an odd, melange that is. So we'll talk about how that expresses itself among Jews here in a few minutes. But so those are some of the cultural sorts of forces that Alexander unleashes, some intentionally, some unintentionally, as he conquers this region. Now, how does this relate to the Bible more specifically? You can probably guess some of the ways, but this is the environment, this is what people, Jews, and then later Christians were, who were reading the Bible, what they were marinating in, culturally speaking, and also many of the people who wrote the Bible. Some of it in the Old Testament, later works, but especially the New Testament. This is what the kind of influences they were subjected to, sometimes consciously responding to, sometimes not consciously responding to. But I wanted to kind of like sketch that kind of cultural kind of environment before going forward. Let me stop there though, and before I talk about how this shapes the Jewish world that is ultimately going to produce the New Testament. But let me stop there and see if you've got any questions or comments about any of these things before I keep going. All right, so this profoundly affects Judaism in the Hellenistic period. There had, even before Alexander, we have the reality of the diaspora, the dispersion, at least since the 6th century, with Babylon destroying the city or destroying the temple and exiling the people. You have Jews outside the land, starting with the time of Alexander. Many of them are living in areas that are Hellenized, subject to heavy doses of Greek culture. So we often call this Hellenistic Judaism. Hellenistic Jews were among the first Christians, especially those evangelized by Paul. So this, couple of centuries of Jewish life, I want to comment on a few things about it. First of all, there's unity and diversity. I mean, there are certain things from the outside, people knew about Jews. They were all over the Mediterranean, and it looked like a single movement. And indeed, there was a lot of shared values and convictions, among insiders. People knew that it was monotheistic, and they had a sense of chosenness, of being a very particular people, which is going to be in tension with this idea that Alexander wants to be promoting of, let's be cosmopolitan. They have a law, they have a temple that they revere, they have a special land. Now, among Jews, there is unity on these elements, but there's diversity as well, because they don't all agree on the importance of them or the meaning of them, how they should be adapted or interpreted. So you might almost say that to be a Jew during this period is to find those things worth arguing about. And people look at them in different ways sometimes based on kind of the cultural influences that they inherit from the Greeks. All right. I also want to talk about how during this period, among Jews in the Hellenistic period, you see two poles between attraction and repulsion. Now, this is what I mean is how outsiders, the people who, so Greeks, for example, how they saw Jews. And they become more aware of Jews as the empire kind of opens up. But there's this kind of spectrum between attraction and repulsion. A lot of non-Jews looked at Judaism and were attracted by it. We have a number of what are called God-fearers. These are people who kind of learn a little bit about Judaism. Maybe they see them also in the city, in big cities where you have a lot of Jewish population, and you say, I'm not part of that community, but there's something about it that's very attractive, very appealing. And so they become God-fearers, which means I might hang out at the synagogue. I might study a little bit. I may not become a Jew. I may not, want to join the community. There may be various barriers. If I'm a male, maybe the circumcision makes me a little hesitant. I don't know. So according to some legends, Nero's wife may have secretly been a God-fearer. Who knows? Some were impressed by their worship that did not involve images, idols. That seemed very noble to some people. A lot of people liked that they weren't required to serve in the military. They were given a break on that, or various tax breaks, because they kind of took care of their own business. Many leaders were willing to kind of say, okay, we'll give you a break on the taxes because you don't draw on the government quite as much, right? So there's that positive kind of response among Greeks and others to Judaism in this period. But then there's also the other realm, other end of the spectrum, which is repulsion. You've got attraction or repulsion. Many people who were not Jews looked at Jews in this period and weren't all that attracted. What are some of the things that non-Jews looked at Jews in the Hellenistic period and probably thought were weird or dangerous, or, to use a strong word, repulsive? What are some things that people knew about Jews? Any ideas of the things that, some of these are stereotypes, but often stereotypes have a root in reality, right? Rick?
Circumcision.
Yeah, circumcision. A lot of people, for understandable reasons, weren't really attracted by that. Many people regarded it as a deformity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Other things about Judaism that seemed different, if not, offensive, but just very different. Yeah.
Were they aloof?
Aloof, yeah. So one term that is used is amixia. They don't mix with other people. They kind of stick to themselves. Is that what you mean, Jimmy?
Maybe. I mean, I heard the early Christians attracted hostility because they were kind of aloof. But maybe we're talking about Jews 300 years before Christ. I don't know if they were that way then or not.
Yeah. So our way of thinking about, we're an open, welcoming church. We welcome visitors. We're dying to get visitors. That was not exactly the way they approach things. Like, here we are, if you want to come, but we're not going to come out and try to beg you to come join our group. And in many cases, not only are we not going to come out and beg you to join our group, we're not going to let you join our group. It's not a public church building or a synagogue. Kind of sometimes secret meetings, So aloof in that sense, and sometimes, they were seen as, if not holier than thou, kind of, they don't want to mix with us. Hey, we want to embrace you in our brotherhood. Why won't you mix with us, Minna?
Well, it seems to me that Jewish cultural cohesion across the centuries is pretty unusual, is it not? Or are other faiths more like that? I don't know. It just they hung together through early centuries and through the Holocaust, and
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's not unique, but it's pretty distinctive. It's hard to say that there's nobody else that's like that, but a long history. You're exactly right, and that can cut both ways, right? And for a lot of people, I've known some people who have converted to Judaism. It's fairly rare, but not unprecedented. But that sense of community was actually this, the one person I have in mind, a good friend of ours, not really religious at all, but she married a man who was Jewish, who's not really religious at all. And the sense of community appealed to her much more than it did to her own husband, who comes from a Jewish background. So that's what appealed to her, and that appeals to a lot of people. Now, a lot of people, it's one of those kind of glass half empty, glass half full. A lot of people look at that and they're like, that cohesiveness kind of leaves me out, though, and so I'm kind of left cold by that, or something like that. But yeah, that's something that was very. Whether you're in Jerusalem or anywhere in the Mediterranean, they seem to kind of find each other and stick together. That's right. Yeah.
Well, the rituals, the dietary, and the idea that Gentiles were unclean. I mean, they set them apart by definition.
Right. And so that's kind of a stronger version of, Jimmy used the term aloof, but yeah, so you could even push it further, right? So they don't want to mix with us. They don't want to eat with us, and that's a big, it's harder for us to grasp because, kind of these sorts of regulations are not something we normally indulge in a whole lot, but not eating with other people. We're not going to eat pork. A lot of people, that's the only thing they do. They don't eat pork. And one of the books, Second Maccabees, one of the kings is like, I just don't understand you guys. Why don't you eat pork? Nature gave us these pigs and they taste so good. Why would God have made them taste so? Why would he make bacon taste so good? Essentially, he says, if he didn't need for us to eat them. And he just can't let them be. He wants, and he tries to make them eat pork, and a lot of people, refuse to eat it on pain of torture. There's this one guy where he's like, hey, here's some chicken. Pretend it's pork and eat it, just so your other Jews will kind of follow suit, and we can all get along here. And he's like, no, I'm not even going to pretend to eat pork. Right. So that's one of those things that was noteworthy. Their dietary practices. They don't work on Saturday, so that makes them stand out. They have, maybe their loyalties are to some other place, right? Jerusalem. Often they're allowed to send their tax, a temple tax, somewhere else. And if I'm living in Greece or in Babylon or something, and I see that money going somewhere else to the temple in Jerusalem, and maybe I question your loyalty. Are you, you live among us, but are you really one of us? And that's another one of those things where it's the good side of the cohesiveness that Minna mentions, but also it can rub some people the wrong way. Going back to a question Jimmy asked last week about the Maccabean revolt, why did Antiochus want to, what was his motive in trying to kind of stamp out Judaism? I mean, in one way, it's kind of divide and conquer, but also I think he wanted some people say he wanted to plunder the temple and take, he knew there was a lot of money there, and he wanted to kind of take that money out in waging a war against Egypt. We're not sure. So anyway, so there are a lot of different elements there that we might say, kind of falls on the spectrum between attraction and repulsion. These people want the benefits of citizenship without really satisfying all the duties. Periodically in Rome, a little bit later, Claudius in 49, for example, will exile the Jews from Rome. They come back a little bit later, but he's like, I don't know if they're really conducive to public order here. All right, now from the perspective of insiders, Jews during the Hellenistic period, we see another sort of kind of spectrum between separatism and assimilation. Separatism and assimilation. A lot of Jews are intent on remaining separate. We have a distinctive culture. We are a chosen people. Thanks Alexander, for your offer of including us in your brotherhood of men here, but we're good. We're going to stay here and we're going to remain separate. We're going to speak our language. We're going to practice our religion. We don't need to kind of mix and match with everybody else. We're going to insist on Jews marrying Jews, for example. We're going to try to anyway. We're not going to study your pagan wisdom and that poetry, that sort of thing. And then on the other side, you've got the tendency to assimilation. This is, again, not going to be unique to Jewish culture in the time of Alexander. You see it with lots of think about immigrant cultures in the United States, just things that we're familiar with. I mean, the first generation of people who come over, from Mexico, just, our neighbor here, look one way, but then what do their kids look like? What do their grandkids look like? I mean, one of the main things is what language are they speaking, right? I mean, many, immigrants are not going to speak English, but it doesn't take very long for their children and their grandchildren not only to speak English, right, but not any longer to be able to speak the language from, in the most common example, to speak Spanish, for example, or whatever language, where they come from. Much to the chagrin of the grandparents, right? I mean, or intermarriage, right? The longer you're here, the more this is home, the more you're comfortable, the more you intermarry with people who are not from your ethnic group. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. It's just kind of an obvious, kind of universal sociological phenomenon, right? So among Jews, you see different kinds of assimilation. We read part of First Maccabees last time, which is part of some Bibles, not the Protestant Bible, but it talked about Alexander and him dying, and then things in Jerusalem in the 2nd century BC. And one of the things it talks about in First Maccabees, it said there were certain Jews who said, let's join with the Gentiles and observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. What that means exactly is not clear, but it says, but so they built a gymnasium or a gymnasium in Jerusalem. Now, a gymnasium is not just a gym, like where you go to work out, though you do go and work out. It's more like, it's not quite a university, but it's kind of a community center where you can work out, you see friends, you go to classes, you can kind of listen to lectures. So according to this, there was a gymnasium, which is, kind of the quintessential cultural institution of the Greek world, introduced to that region, in the aftermath of Alexander's conquest here. You've got a gymnasium there. Here's a trivia question. So the word gymnasium comes from the Greek root gymnos. Do you know what the word gymnos means?
Well, it might mean naked because they had to be naked.
That is right. You are on fire this morning. That's right. So right, you exercise. So here we have Jews in Jerusalem building a gymnasium and exercising, in the Greek style. You're exactly right. And the next verse there says, and so not only do they exercise in the Gentile custom, well, what becomes clear when you are exercising in the Gentile custom? Well, I guess a lot of things become clear. Among them is whether you're circumcised or not. And here it says, and some of these men removed the marks of circumcision. So it seems to be there was some primitive form of plastic surgery, I guess, where you can make it look like you were not circumcised, even if you were circumcised. Well, there's not a specific law of Moses against that, but, if there were, it would be anti, that's the very sign of the covenant. So you have in First Maccabees, a sign of kind of extreme Hellenization, a kind of extreme assimilation, taking that form. But it takes a variety of forms. I've listed a number of names of figures who are not going to be exactly household names, but there's someone named Philo, the epic poet. Probably Philo was a pretty common name, but there's a guy named Philo who wrote about Jewish subjects about biblical heroes in the style of Homer, in epic poet style, in dactylic hexameter, for example. You have Philo of Alexandria, who we know a lot about. A different Philo lived in Alexandria in northern Egypt, of course, founded by Alexander. Probably the biggest Jewish city in the world, probably a couple of 100,000 Jewish people lived in Alexandria. But Philo wrote a lot. We have a lot of his writings, and he kind of, he's Jewish through and through. He writes about all kinds of different Jewish figures, Jewish teachings, but he's also deeply immersed in Platonist philosophy. He studied Plato, he talks about Plato, and he tries to kind of reconcile Judaism and Platonic philosophy. Some might say, how can you do that? Well, read him and see if you're convinced that it can be done or if it can't be done. There were other writers, I don't think Philo does this, but there are other writers who say, actually, the Greek philosophers got their best ideas from Moses, who was older than them. We don't really have any record of that. And you can read Moses yourself, and you can read the Greek philosophers yourself and see if you're persuaded by that kind of assimilation. There's a writer named Ezekiel the Tragedian. A lot of these are from, I've got this big book called Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. This one is very small print, 900 pages, and it's just volume 2. I've got another of these. These are writings produced in this Hellenistic era for the most part. A lot of it written in the name of Old Testament figures, but it's sort of expanded. It's kind of like, fan fiction or something like that, like more legends that are not in the Bible. Ezekiel the Tragedian is in this writing. So he's a guy named Ezekiel. He's not the Ezekiel from the Bible. He's not pretending to be the Ezekiel from the Bible, I don't think. But he writes Greek tragedy, except it's not Greek tragedy like Oedipus the King or, the Oresteia and Aeschylus or Euripides and Medea. It's not that. It's in that style, but it's about biblical subjects. For example, he wrote a tragedy called The Exodus, where it's the story of the Exodus in the style of a Greek tragedy. We don't know if it was performed on stage or not. And I'm not really we don't have it in its entirety. We just have it in fragments. I'm curious about what the whole thing would look like, because tragedies are stories that end, tragically. From a Jewish perspective, the Exodus story ended pretty happily, right? They got out of slavery in Egypt, so I'm not sure exactly what that looked like. But that's another example of this kind of cultural kind of assimilation, which not everybody was involved in, but a lot of people who were reading the Bible were familiar with this sort of stuff. Theodotus is another Jewish writer who wrote about a number of biblical topics, but wrote in the style of, he wrote really good dactylic hexameter, which again is kind of the epic meter. You might think that separatist and assimilationist corresponds to sort of conservative to liberal or progressive or something like that. Often it does in this Jewish setting, but not always. Theodotus, for example, highly assimilated linguistically, culturally. He writes perfect Homeric kind of verse. But when he writes about it, and he writes about these biblical subjects, he is insistent that you must be circumcised, and intermarriage with non-Jews, that's forbidden. So that's kind of a mix of this, like kind of culturally very, liberal or assimilationist, but in terms of content, very conservative. This is not perfect terms, but he's like, I'm very traditional. So it's interesting to note. You have an ancient legend reported about Aristotle meeting a Jew who was a Greek, not only in his language, but also in his very soul. We don't find out much more about this, but it's interesting to see that we have these reports of way back, even that would, I guess, be even before Alexander, perhaps, where you have highly Hellenized Jews. Now you have other, kind kind of building on that, you have other kind of medieval Jewish legends about Aristotle becoming Jewish, highly unlikely, or Aristotle, what was it? Was it Aristotle having an affair with Alexander's wife? You have all these kind of crazy kind of stories, but how much of this Greek influence is felt within Palestine and not out in the diaspora? That is a matter of some dispute. Some would say it was kind of sealed off from a lot of that Greek influence. But we see that it wasn't totally sealed off from it. After all, the New Testament, and stories about Jesus, Gospels, are all written in Greek. There was probably some material written in Hebrew, and he was not probably walking around speaking in Greek. I think probably Jesus could have spoken Greek, but the stories are written. But we think Aramaic was his first language, but the stories are written in Greek. So how much of that was just out in the diaspora and not in Palestine is uncertain. So these are just a few examples of kind of highly assimilated Jews, people who were reading the Bible, some of them who might have written some of the texts that will later become part of the Bible, or edited them, or copied them over, or things along those lines. All right, I'm going to talk about Jewish apologetic literature, but I don't know if there are other examples that come to mind or questions about some of these names or examples that I've cited here. Does anybody have any questions? I don't think I see anything in the chat. All right. So now I want to talk about Jewish apologetic literature that arises in this period. So 3rd century BC, 2nd century, 1st century BC, leading up to the rise of Christianity. Apologetic, not I'm sorry. What does the term apologetic mean in this connection? What's an apologetic purpose, apologetic writing?
It's a defense of one's religion and practice.
Yeah, a defense. Jimmy, you were going to say that or something different? Just looking at who's not muted. Yeah, defense, explanation. Often it's a religious or a philosophical thing. Sometimes it can be political. There's a lot of Jewish apologetic literature that we see produced here. Looking at my notes here. And sometimes in trying to explain, sometimes you're literally explaining yourself to somebody else. Sometimes you're trying to help yourself understand things. And in trying to explain yourself to somebody else, sometimes things can get distorted when you're trying to make a connection. I mean, first of all, you have to speak the other person's language, literally and figuratively, or else you can't really explain yourself very well. And so one of the major, well, I'll come down to the Septuagint in a few minutes. But one of the writings that's in the Apocrypha, and these are Jewish writings that are still in some in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, not in Jewish or Protestant Bibles. One of the writings is called Ben Sira. It's sometimes called Sirach, sometimes called Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiastes. But in Ben Sira, who's writing probably in the 2nd century BC, there's a prologue to his writing. It appears as though this was first written in Hebrew, but then got translated so that Jews, most of whom spoke Greek at this period, could understand it. But there's a paragraph where he says this. He says, "So I'm giving you this book of my grandfather's writing." So his grandson seems to have translated it. "You are invited to read it with goodwill and attention, and to be indulgent in cases where, despite our diligent labor in translating, we may seem to have rendered some phrases imperfectly. For what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. not only this book that I'm translating, but even the law itself, the prophecies, and the rest of the books differ not a little when read in the original. So this is a, kind of an interesting kind of point he's making, and it's that, I mean, what we all know, which is, as the Italians say, traditore tradutori, translators are traitors. There are certain things when you're translating from one language to another that just cannot be conveyed perfectly. Even when you're being super careful, things change. Now, when that's the word of God, then that's kind of a little dicey, right? This is one reason why in Islam, if it's not in Arabic, it's not officially considered the Quran, right? I mean, Jews and Christians, we read these books, read the Bible in translation. We might say, hey, I'd like to know some Hebrew, I'd like to know some Greek, but we generally don't say, hey, it's not scripture if it's not in those original languages. But he's kind of like recognizing that some things change. I've tried not to, but in making that, trying to speak that language of the other, things might change. Now, I don't think he's writing this for non-Jews. He's writing it for Jews who no longer speak Hebrew. Same thing in a book called Fourth Maccabees, which is in some Bibles, but not all. When you read Fourth Maccabees, it's written in Greek, and it's another story about the Maccabean martyrs resisting forced Hellenization. But when you read it, and we might talk about this next time, it's hard to distinguish these Jews from Stoic philosophers. I mean, the way he talks about the kind of the heart of Judaism sounds like Stoic philosophy. I'll talk about Stoic philosophy next week. We have people like Josephus and Philo. Now, these are first century Jews, so a little bit later, but they are writing in ways that are trying to explain or defend certain Jewish institutions, certain Jewish concepts, certain Jewish ideas to non-Jewish audiences. One of my favorite examples is a writer named Artapanus. And he's a Hellenized, Greek-speaking Jew, celebrating Jewish culture, celebrating Jewish heroes in an environment where, I know about the Greeks and these people and those people, and they know about us. There's a little bit of a competition, I guess you could say. And you have Artapanus writing in the 2nd century BC about the great Jewish hero Moses. And of course, these kind of expand, Moses was an important figure in Jewish history. He's an important person in before he became an important person for the Jews, he was an important person for the Egyptians, right? And that's even in the Bible. I mean, it doesn't expand on that, but he was kind of like an important figure. Remember, his mother was his adoptive mother was the daughter of the Pharaoh. He was an important figure before he, identifies with his people and goes off to the desert and comes back. But in this writing of Artapanus, he's telling us how great Moses was. He said, when Moses became a man, he was called Museos by the Greeks. This Moses became the teacher of Orpheus. When he reached manhood, he bestowed on humanity many useful contributions. Moses invented ships, machines for lifting stones, Egyptian weapons, devices for drawing water and fighting, and he also invented Jewish philosophy. He was a important political figure. He divided the Egyptian state into 36 districts, and to each of those districts he assigned the proper god to be worshipped. In addition, he assigned the sacred writings to the priests. The gods he assigned were cats and dogs and ibises, and on and on. So here you have a Jewish writer celebrating Moses for, among other things, organizing Egyptian religion. A lot of people look at that and say, I don't know if this guy's Jewish, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that may be negotiable when it comes to Jewish identity, but some might draw the line at being a real kind of important figure in organizing Egyptian religion, especially us saying we should worship cats and dogs and ibises and herons and this and that. So the guy who actually edited, this is a book by Louis Feldman called Jewish Life and Thought Among the Greeks and Romans. Fascinating collection of sources. He looks at this and says, I'm going to include him in here. I don't even think he's Jewish. I think, maybe maybe he should go in some other book, because I can't imagine, he says, that person would actually be would identify as a Jew. So the last thing I'll mention here, and we're about out of time, I may expand on this next time, but the perhaps most significant example of assimilation of a sort is the production of a full translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which takes place in Alexandria, probably around the year 200, is called the Septuagint. It's abbreviated this LXX. The word actually means 70, Septuagint, because it was translated by 70 or perhaps 72 translators. There's a whole story about that, which the story might have to wait until next week. But it's fascinating, and it's an important milestone too in the Hellenization of Judaism during this period between Alexander and the New Testament. Why don't I pause there? I've got 10:37 on the clock there. See if you've got any questions or comments on some of this material. I think probably a lot of this maybe is familiar to some of you, but I hope I've introduced some new names and faces here, some writings on this topic. So let me just stop there and see if there's anything that we need to do before we finish.
There's a bad job by Moses to leave the boat and stone lifting drawings out of the book of Leviticus. We could really have used that.
There's a lot in there, but yeah. So he was quite the Renaissance man.
Do we know exactly when the Septuagint was produced? I mean, is it a precise time or?
So not all at one time, but by the around the year 200 BC, it's already starting to be translated. First with the law, with the Pentateuch, and then within probably a century, the rest of it gets produced. But it's not like all at one time. But yeah, right around the year 200 BC is when it begins getting translated. And I can talk more about that next time, about some of the stories about it and what's interesting about it. All right. All right. Well, thank you. I'll leave it to you, Rick, and Judy, if there's anything we need to do here to wrap up. Is that all? All right, stay warm, everybody, then. And I'll see you next week, same time, same place.
Thanks, everybody.